able to participate a little bit. So I will first just say hello. My name is Jennifer McDougall. I am a clinical assistant professor at East Carolina University in Greenville, North Carolina. Just so you know kind of a little bit about my background and why I do this and why I'm doing this presentation. I actually started my career as a vocational rehabilitation counselor in North Carolina State VR. And then I also simultaneously worked with in a private substance abuse clinic as a substance abuse counselor. And so I was actually able, interestingly, to be able to do both of these jobs at the same time, licensed both as a addictions counselor and then also working as a CRC at the time. And so what I ended up doing was I started to notice as I began to, as many of you probably have experienced, there was a lot of turnover happening. So we were having a lot of new counselors coming in, and there was a lot of open caseloads. And so I started taking over multiple caseloads and had to take on the substance abuse caseload that we had in our office, as well as the mental health caseload kind of at different times. And one of the things that I saw while I was in vocational rehabilitation, kind of covering those caseloads, while also covering my own, I'm sure you all have been there and had to do similar work. While I was covering those caseloads, though, I noticed that there was a number of challenges that were happening with regard to how the counselors were interacting with the clients, especially as new counselors were coming on. I noticed that there seemed to be kind of this challenge with employment for individuals with substance use disorders and perceptions among the individuals that were actually working with the clients on that caseload. And being that I was simultaneously working as a substance abuse counselor outside of VR, it kind of took me aback a little bit. And so part of what I did to resolve that for myself was I went back to get my PhD specifically to begin to train rehab counselors and to change perceptions a little bit in terms of people who have substance use disorders. And so I have talked with Peggy, and she indicated that this was something that we don't really talk a lot about, or it's kind of challenging to get, continuing ed sometimes on substance use disorders specific to vocational rehabilitation in a lot of ways. And so I offered to do this presentation so that we could talk a little bit about stigma. The bulk of this presentation is going to be talking about stigma and how it relates to people with substance use disorders specifically, and then toward the end we'll talk a little bit about the actual relationship and how stigma could be potentially impacting your relationships with those clients. Before we kind of get into the presentation, though, I would like to know who is present with us. And so if you could, I'm going to go down the names that I have here. I do have somebody that says that's on the list there that says that they're a caller. So I'll call you and say caller. So if you're on the phone, then you'll know I'm talking to you. But I'm going to kind of go down the list, and if you'll tell me just your name. I see it on here, but if you can tell us your name as well as tell me where you work and a little bit about your experience, how long you've been there, what you do, what your role is, and then also tell me a little bit about how you interact with clients with substance use disorders. Like, are they on your caseload, or how are they a part of your life in your position right now? So I guess we'll start with Anita, if you are open to that. Anita, would you be willing to share with me some of that information?
Sure. I'm an LPC. I currently work as a VR counselor for the State Department of Voc Rehab. Of course, I worked with people with substance abuse issues when I was doing LPC work. And right now, with the work I do, it's surprising to me, and I suppose it shouldn't be, how many of my clients do have the dual diagnosis, and that is one of their major disorders. And it is a struggle every day for them, and not only in their personal life, but finding work and maintaining that.
Absolutely. And what state do you work in? I'm sorry, you said you work for a state VR. Which state are you in?
Oklahoma.
Okay, wonderful. I only I know that certain state policies with regard to eligibility for people with substance use disorders is a little bit different from state to state. And so I just wanted to kind of confirm that we were in different states and some of my policies might not apply to you. So thank you for
Sure.
sharing, Anita. I appreciate that. Okay, I'm going to move on to caller. I'm not sure who you might be. So if you could share us your name, where you're from, what you do, and how you interact with people with substance use disorders now.
I guess that would be me. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Morning. My name is Marcelina, and I'm a VR counselor with the state of New Mexico, and I've been at my job for over two decades, 20 years. We have been receiving a lot of referrals from the local substance use treatment centers, and the referrals have kind of, gradually decreased, but there at one point there was, we had a lot of cases on our caseloads, serving individuals with substance abuse disorders. And of course, we're in a rural area, so there are people who have addiction issues, primarily alcohol, and Native American. We do serve a majority of our populations are Native American. So out in the rural areas, it's been alcohol. Secondary have been most recently meth addiction, meth addiction, and right now, like I said, the cases, I'm not sure if it's due to the centers not maybe getting a lot of clients, but the referrals for some reason have decreased.
Right.
Yeah.
That's an interesting observation. And is it? And correct me if I'm saying it wrong. Did you say Marcelina was your name?
Yes.
Okay. That's actually interestingly enough a trend across the nation actually during this COVID pandemic is that referrals are going down, but use is actually increasing. And so a lot of the use is actually happening behind closed doors now, more so. And so there's actually higher rates of substance abuse happening, but it's less likely that we're going to get referrals for treatment for it, which is kind of interesting and unfortunate. So thank you for sharing your observations with us. That was very helpful to know. Appreciate it. Let's see. We have, I think it's Christina next on the list.
Hello, can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Hi, I am with Oklahoma Department of Rehabilitation Services. I have been with the agency for about 10 years. 4 of that was as a tech, and now I'm a counselor. I've actually seen my referrals for mental health and substance abuse disorder decreasing.
Yeah. What's your primary caseload normally? Like, because you said you see the referrals for those coming in kind of decreasing. Is that your typical caseload, or do you deal with other disabilities?
I deal with all. I mean,
Okay.
all physical, cognitive. I mean, I have a lot of people wanting to go to college, transition age youth, and then people just seeking employment.
Okay. Yeah, because every agency works a little bit differently in terms of how they distribute the caseloads, and so I never really quite know whether people have, because I know from our North Carolina VR, we used to have them like sectioned off ability types, and I just don't think that's a way that they can happen a lot anymore without many comorbidities and co-occurring disorders that individuals have. So thank you for sharing, Christina. It's interesting that you're seeing that those referrals are going down. It sounds like kind of consistent with what Marcelina was saying as well. So thank you. Is it Lori? Or mic may not be working. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if Lori heard me, maybe. I don't know. That's okay. We'll move on to, how about Miranda?
Hi, can you all hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, hi, I'm Miranda Brazil, and I'm a VR counselor with the Oklahoma Department of Rehab Services. I've been in this position for about 4 years, but I worked in substance abuse prior to coming here with a substance abuse agency after I graduated and received my master's while I was going to graduate school. Also, I was working at the substance abuse agency. I have a mixed caseload also. I work with transition in adults and work with various disabilities. And my referrals also have been kind of down, probably a lot due with COVID. But I do have a particular area where we get some referrals from the agencies, the substance abuse agencies there, but they haven't been, like I said, a lot recently.
Yeah, it's interesting. It seems like to be a pattern that we're seeing a lot of decrease in those referrals, and it's unfortunate because we're actually there's higher rates of unemployment simultaneously with higher rates of addiction and mental health issues happening. And so it's kind of interesting that we're seeing less reaching out for help, or at least at the bare minimum the referring for help, and that is probably just indicative of, like you all were mentioning, the COVID situation that we tend to be in right now. Can I ask you all, what are some of the things that you were hoping to get out of this presentation today? Some things that, or what drove you, I guess, to register for this particular presentation? Anybody can answer for that one, whatever you would like.
I think I want a better understanding on how to help people in the resources and referrals to be able to provide to them.
Okay. Resources, referrals to give them in terms of helping them with like obtaining employment or anything specific?
Yeah, obtaining employment, completing their set goals, things
Okay.
like that.
Wonderful. All right. How about anyone else? Anita? Or was that Anita? I'm sorry.
Yeah, like Christina said, I'm kind of in that same boat. Also, anytime there's something out there about the stigma and substance abuse disorders, that always just piques my interest because it is such a prevalent problem in our society in what seems to be all walks of life.
Yeah. It's like most disabilities, it doesn't discriminate, does it? Anybody can have it happen, and yet it is a very discriminated against condition. So that's
Exactly.
great.
Exactly.
Else?
Hi, this is Lori.
Oh, hi, Lori. Oh,
Hi,
right. To introduce yourself. No, you're fine. Would you like to introduce yourself too? I think we missed you there.
I think I got everything working here. My name's Lori Strong. I'm a vocational evaluator in private practice in Maryland, and I have a diverse caseload, but of course this year very slow, doing some virtual career assessments for the Rehab Services Maryland, but it's picking up now, but it's been a slow year, of course.
I don't doubt it.
And for this course, I don't have a specific pointed question or reason. I just thought it really sounded interesting, and I certainly have worked with many clients in voc rehab with substance abuse disorders, and it seems to be picking up over the last, well, this year is an exception, but last year, There just seems to be so much brokenness and depression and mental health issues that it seems to go with it more, couple with it more. And but it's always been there in the clients, in many referrals I see. But thank you for the information. I'm just seeing what you have, and just was kind of wanted to just see what it was about today.
Okay. Well, thank you, Lori. I appreciate that. So I appreciate a little bit of feedback as we go through. I try to keep that in mind as we talk about this. And I'm going to go ahead and apologize now that if I mix you guys up, because I'm only voices, and it tells me kind of who's talking down in the corner, but it's not easy for me to see a lot. And so if I mix up who it is that I see talking, I apologize in advance for me if I say something wrong. And so I do appreciate your participation, and anything that you can do in this later on in the presentation. There's an opportunity. That would be a great idea, Anita. Anita says that you could say your names before you speak. That would be really helpful. So if you do remember to do that, that would be excellent. And then we can kind of go from there. And then that way I always know who it is that's talking. As we go through this, I just encourage a lot of participation and discussions, because I want it to be specific to your experiences and to help in that, make it applicable to you and what you're going through and what you're experiencing right now. And so please feel free to interject throughout this presentation as well. You could always throw stuff in the chat box if you don't want to interrupt, just as Anita was doing. And so feel free to put anything in there. I'll also ask for forgiveness for my background, as many of you probably have done or are doing. I don't know. Working from home, and so that's kind of this has been my office for 6 months now, so I apologize. It's not a pretty fancy office, and I don't have the cool backgrounds that a lot of people do, but I appreciate you all attending, and let's get started. So let's talk first a little bit about oh, this is coming up a little awkward, isn't it? We're going to talk first. We'll do a little self-assessment, and then we'll actually go over different types of stigma. And then we're going to talk about how it shows itself really in the counseling relationship, what we can do. When I talk about this case studies and role play down at the bottom, this is something that we're going to do kind of toward the end in breakout rooms if we have enough. If we don't, then for those of you that are watching later, then it would be helpful if you kind of did this, I guess, independently on your own as well. But we're going to take a little time toward the end to kind of do a little bit of role play and go over a case study to see how do we handle that in terms of our relationship. So let's first take this self-assessment. So here's this. If you have a mobile device, and I'm going to, for those of you, because I know that one of you is actually on the phone, Marcelina, I believe, is on the phone, and so she may not be able to do this. I'm going to also send the link in the chat box, but this is going to be a little self-assessment that if you take your phone and you scan this QR code, it should take you straight to it. If it does not, I am going to put this link in the chat box. So if you can take just a couple minutes to complete this assessment. And let me know if you're having any troubles getting to that link. And for those of you that might be watching a little bit later, I will make sure that has this link as well, so that you might be able to get it posted somewhere. I'm not sure, Peggy, if we can get it posted somewhere.
Okay, yes, we can. We can
Wonderful.
send everybody out a link to it also when we send out the report.
Great. Great. So this is anonymous. I don't get your results, so I don't want you to. I want you to be as honest as possible on this when you really think about each of these responses. And if you'll just throw in the chat box, done, write done in the chat box when you are finished. Thank you, Anita. Thank you, Nicole. Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you, Miranda, Christina. I think I'm going to go ahead and if you're still finishing that up, that is perfectly fine. Let me know, just continue to do it and let me know in the chat box when you are finished. But for those of you that have completed it, what are your thoughts on this kind of tool? What did it measure? If you're being honest with yourself, I don't need to know like what you specifically answered or anything like that, but I'm wondering what you thought of this instrument in general. Any thoughts? It was good for encouraging self-reflection. Good. I'm glad it was helpful. Any other thoughts on it? Made me think about my emotions around addiction. Yes. And that's something I strongly encourage as we go through this today. I would like for you guys, and I don't to know any of it. I don't need to know your thoughts or your innermost workings or anything like that. But as we go through this, I really want you to be honest and reflective about your experiences. This tool that you've taken was originally designed to measure healthcare provider stigma surrounding mental health issues in general. So it's been adapted to focus on on rehab counseling in general, as well as the addictions aspect, because you can kind of change it a little bit. One of the things that we've seen is that stigma has actually been decreasing for mental health issues. People tend to be a little bit more sensitive now to mental health issues broadly. Depression, anxiety, people are a little bit more sensitive, a little bit more open about talking about these things. But addiction hasn't seen that same thing. As providers, what's Anita, and let's see, Anita's saying, as providers, we do need to be aware of our possible biases. Absolutely, whether they're negative or positive. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later too. It was good for self-reflection. If you didn't have any knowledge about addiction or experience working with clients, your responses may have been different. That's a good point. Lori says, it made me think about how I've changed and grown in the last 15 years. That's excellent. I'm glad to hear that. And the is that you do kind of grow and learn. And we're going to talk a little bit later as well and come back to this here and there throughout the presentation as you kind of think about it. And if there's places there that you still are like, yeah, I don't really want my kids to be around somebody with an addiction, even if it's well controlled, but I'm fine with working with them. Those are just things to think about as we go through this. So let me ask you, what do you think stigma is? What does it even mean? The unknown. What do you mean by that? I'm going to read while I'm assuming you're going to type your response. You can definitely speak it if you would like, but I kind of want to know what you mean about the unknown. And Anita says, often negative associations made automatically related to certain conditions. Right, okay. Shame can be associated, Nicole says. right, Christina, what were you going to clarify on yours? Oh, maybe you were typing.
That's okay. I'll go ahead and say it. It's people that they don't know what they're dealing with, and they often go with their assumptions, knowledge.
Yeah. So if you're not familiar with it, then we kind of just work on our assumptions and go based on that. And so you guys are coming up with a lot of different parts of what stigma is, right? And so part of the challenge that we've really had in kind of narrowing down how to solve this problem of stigma is that over the years we haven't really had a consistent definition of stigma, and it's actually a good thing. It sounds like, oh, well, we need like a consistent definition. But the reason that we don't have a consistent definition is because so many different professionals are involved in understanding what stigma is. And it's based on different populations and different types of conditions. And so we often don't have one consistent way of kind of operationalizing or understanding stigma. Lori is saying hold a person's addiction and choices against them in future interactions. Yes, that's a part of it, isn't it? And so one of the things that I'll kind of give you a little bit of history. Stigma itself really comes from a Greek term of a mark. They used to use this as a way, the Greek term was a mark, a dot, a puncture. And it actually came about, and it was an actual term, an actual letter in Greek alphabet that was actually used to mark slaves and to denote between the different social classes. And so this idea of stigma, this mark of something not being correct and not being the chosen class, has been through with us since ancient Greece. The idea that uh, we think of people as being different based on a single marking. And so when we think about stigma with regard to addiction, that addiction is that mark. That's that indication that says that these people are different from us in some way. And not only are they different, but they're lower in some way, right? And so the Irving Goffman was one of the earlier researchers to start to begin to look at stigma as it applies to different groups of people, and in particular, people with disabilities. And one of the things that he really kind of pointed out was that it really becomes about a spoiled identity. That we now, if we have this mark, whatever that might be, a disabling condition, it could be a perspective, it could be an addiction, it could be just a something looking different, it could be poverty, it could be something that is different from what the expectation should be, that has now soiled or tarnished the individual's personality and who they are. Stigma, if you start to think everything that you all talked about and suggested as a part of stigma, is absolutely part of that, because it's a process. Stigma, when we think about it in terms of mental health and substance abuse, is actually this overarching process that's interrelated with different types of concepts. The first part of this process tends to be the labeling. When we think about how people get from having something, some kind of condition, to being stigmatized against and having problems in their life because of the, as Anita says, negative associations that are made related to that condition, it starts with a label, right? It starts with, this person is an alcoholic. That label of alcoholism and that label of alcoholic is in and of itself nothing, right? It's just a label. It's not something that necessarily is one thing or the other. Now, what happens is that when we start to put those negative attributes toward it, as Anita was talking about, that's that next stage of the process. Now we have these negative attributes that are associated with alcoholism. And what are some of those negative attributes that are placed on, like, let's say, alcoholism as an example? Lazy. Good point. Weak. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Lazy, weak. No self-control, sure, absolutely. If you wanted to stop, you would, right? And so there's this, and selfish, yeah, that's a great one. And that happens a lot with regard to any levels of addiction, any substance, right? And so when we think about alcoholism, in and of itself, the label of having alcoholism means nothing. It's not until we start to attribute negative perspectives to it. And once that happens, what ends up happening is that then we separate ourselves, right? We say, well, that's a them problem. That's not an us problem. So those negative things that happen with that alcoholism, that's a them. And they are now somehow different from us who don't have those problems. And we'll talk a little bit more in as we go through how these different things happen within our society and what happens as a result of that. Once we start to separate them because of that mark, because of alcoholism, because of opiate addiction, whatever it is, and then we attribute these negative stereotypes to it, right? The selfishness, lack of self control, they're lazy, they're weak, all of these things, then, and we say, they're not us. That's not how we are. And then we begin, the crucial aspect of this is that we then they lose status because of that. In society, we now say, you know what, because you have all these negative attributes, now you are down here while I am up here. Because I can look down on you and say, you're lazy, you're weak, you have lack of self control, you're selfish, all of those things. And so what ends up happening is that we separate them and they lose status within society. When that happens, it now becomes acceptable to begin to discriminate behaviorally. So prior to this, all until we actively begin to discriminate, there's a lot that's happening from more of a mental and kind of unspoken type of process, right? Like this is us processing as individuals. Now, it makes sense to a certain extent how this would happen, right? If we think about kind of back when we're trying to be successful as being human beings and not getting eaten by other animals or other predators in the society or in the world at the time, we had to kind of get together and be in groups and work together to get towards some kind of goal. There were also threats from other groups and other part that when we have very scarce resources, oftentimes we're fighting over these resources. And so what ends up happening, it makes sense that we would then say, well, that's them. We need this us and them mentality to protect ourselves. Unfortunately, we're not in, or fortunately, we're not in kind of that type of environment anymore. So we don't really need this us and them mentality, but it's still there, right? And we see it with everybody. It's not just people with addiction, right? Like we see this throughout in all people, in all groups, in all cultures, and no matter where we go, we see this us and them mentality. There's something comforting as human beings to feel like we belong to a group and that there's outsiders to our group. And that in and of itself isn't necessarily any difference, any weakness seems to bring it out. Absolutely. Anytime that we start to notice a difference, it makes us feel, oh, well, I'm part of this group. I'm a in with them. It's an us over here. It's a them over there. And that in and of itself, again, is not necessarily the issue that we see in society until we start the active process, or what it leads to is this active process of behaviorally discriminating against individuals that we perceive as a them, because then they lose status. We can have two groups that are completely equal, and they are different, and they can say, well, I belong to this, I belong to that group, but we're equal, so it doesn't really affect our society. But as soon as we say that they don't have the same status as another group, that's when the discrimination becomes acceptable. And so part of what we have to look at when we're talking about working with people with addictions is that how do we change that status loss? How do we kind of look at, one, we have to change those negative connotations, those negative attributes, right? And we also have to be honest with ourselves as helpers and as providers. Like, Do we also kind of sometimes ascribe to that when we see those stories about those parents who were slumped up in front seat of their car, overdosed with their 2-year-old in the back seat? Do we not kind of have those fleeting thoughts of how could they do that to their kid, right? And so those things, we have to be honest with ourselves. Do we have those negative connotations associated with certain addictions, certain behaviors, whatever that might be? And then we have to work on also identifying whether or not this is because of a status loss issue. Are we saying that because it is different, because that difference is there or that weakness is there, is it okay that we now say that they're not as good as us, whatever that might look like? So those are things that we have to kind of think about, and that's how we end up with these different types of stigma. So what we'll talk about here is that there's actually kind of two main types of stigma. There's a public stigma that happens kind of out in the community toward the individual with an addiction. And then there's self-stigma, which is more of the stigma that the individual themselves feels. And so we're going to break each of these down so that we can kind of get a better perspective of what that looks like. One of the first things is this idea of public stigma. Broadly, it's really talking about how we reject people in society. It's in a broad sense, and I'm not sure what happened with the font sizes once I started sharing, because my file of that doesn't look like that. So I'm not sure what's going on here. So I apologize that there's a little overlap there. But part of what happens is that this is in this public stigma where we're talking about this actual rejection in society of individuals with addiction. Probably what you've seen and what we hear and we hear, we see the commercials about it. We see how other people talk about each other outside in public. It usually, and we also see it like with our employers, right? Like if people with addiction aren't employed at a lot at the same rate of people with other types of disability. The interesting thing is that employment is probably one of the highest ways that we actually see this public stigma on top of a legal issue. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But employment rates typically for people with addiction oftentimes are much lower than it is for even other mental health issues. And so one of the interesting things, like I mentioned earlier, is that we're seeing kind of a decrease in the stigma associated with mental health issues in general, like depression, anxiety, and those types of things. But not for substance abuse, and not nearly as much. Why do you think that is? Any thoughts? And I know it takes you a second to type, so it is because of stigma, but why do you think it's not change? It seems to be getting better for other types of mental health, but not for addiction. Not enough awareness. I think part of it is a stereotypical image of some types of substance abusers. Absolutely. Nicole said some people think addiction is self-inflicted. That's a great thought. And Anita gave the example of junkies. Miranda says that some people do not understand that addictions can stem from mental illness. That's a good point. And Lori is saying perception that it's only a personal choice. Yes, all of those things. So one of the things that we know is that personal responsibility, as well as the perceived dangerousness of the condition or the mark, tends to also determine the level of stigma associated with the different within the public. And so one of the big reasons that we don't see or that we see employment rates a lot worse for people with addictions is because they're perceived as being potentially more dangerous than people with like just depression. I did a study at one point where I actually asked employers about a willingness to hire people with substance use disorders over people with mental health disorders, specifically depression, and compared these two, and what employers consistently rated higher and higher in terms of concerns, or over and over again in terms of concerns, was that they were worried that the person was going to be dangerous to their coworkers. And so that's something to consider, that don't worry about that with depression and anxiety. We do still see that same level of stigma with other dangerous or other conditions that are perceived to be dangerous, such as schizophrenia. And so we do see people aren't the people aren't just offering to come have people with schizophrenia come over and watch their children, just like they're not willing to have somebody who is an opiate addict come in and watch their children, right? But they're not as upset as having somebody with depression or anxiety to come in and talk with them. And so those are some things to kind of just be aware of as we talk about this. As a result, as many of you are probably aware, that also determines whether or not an individual is going to be willing to disclose their disability, right? Especially when it comes to addiction. And yet, they kind of need to in many cases, especially if they're in early recovery, because they often have to engage in treatment that is going to be daily, and they might have to be going to support group meetings, and sometimes they might need time off for those things. And so that is something to consider. Another way that we see symbolic stigma happening is within relationships, losing family or friends when they are receiving treatment in particular. And if you recall from that instrument that I had you take earlier, that was one of the questions, that if you had an addiction, would you tell someone? And part of the reason that people hesitate to tell them is because of losing family or friends. They aren't willing to really engage. Remember some of those questions, and that social distance. The idea of social distance is how close you want someone to be to you when they have this mark or this addiction, when we're thinking about it in those terms. And in many cases, the closer that they are to you, like watching your child, many people are like, I'm going to push you away when you have an addiction. They don't want, most people in society don't want somebody really close to them that has an addiction. So they're willing to maybe have them as a coworker in some cases, depending on the field, depending on what their responsibility is in the job. But they may not be willing to marry a person with an addiction or other things like that. And so it's when that does happen often, and people do develop addictions, and oftentimes their family walks away and says, I'm not going to help you anymore. Now, doesn't necessarily mean that it's right or wrong, because in some cases families members feel justified if they feel like they've been taken advantage of in those situations, such as uh, having financial means stolen from them or other things like that. Um, Other things that we that also influence public stigma tends to be our media, right? Often when we see pictures of people with addiction, as some of you were mentioning earlier, there's this image of it, and it's either that they're lazy, or they, like, if they're a alcoholic lying in the streets, they're not doing anything, so they're lazy. But then they also might be those individuals that are like high on something and engaging in, unsavory behavior. Like, so think about a couple years ago, it was going like all over the news. They were showing all these high profile cases of individuals who were getting high on bath salts and then engaging in some pretty violent and vicious behavior, which was not common, but it was sensational information. So it was like, wow, we're going to put this on the news. And so oftentimes that's what it focuses on. You also focus on, a lot of times the media will focus on, and this is in film and TV and books and things like that. You'll see that it's focused a lot on, the behaviors from individuals that are using psychedelic substances, and obviously they're having hallucinations, and so they say, oh, well, these hallucinations now have turned violent. And these things don't really happen that often, but when they do, it's so extreme that media and other people, that's what they see. They see the extreme ends of this, right? And it's not something that you're not seeing in the middle. The people that are functioning, oftentimes those aren't the images that we're seeing, and that is where a lot of our public stigma comes from, and it's from where things we see, because we don't all have somebody in our life necessarily that has an addiction issue. It's common, though. My guess is that many of you in here have someone in your life that you knew with an addiction, or have met somebody with it, not just your clients. I mean, more on a personal level. Um, so, part of public stigma, when we start breaking this down, is this idea of structural stigma. So, structural stigma are those things that are happening kind of within our society, that are within policy, within laws, and things like that. So, we've kind of, as a society, accepted, like in the United States, for instance. That's where I'm going to focus a lot of I'm going to focus our conversation on, because that's where we live. And so, in the United States, a lot of our laws, things that we do related to, and choices that we make, from a criminal standpoint, as well as policies in terms of what gets funded and things like that, have to do with the stigma that we have accepted toward individuals with addiction and mental health issues. One of the things that has happened there, when it comes to structural stigma, there's kind of two levels of this. There's the intended structural stigma, and then there's the unintended structural stigma. So intentional is like the laws and policies we make specifically to kind of limit people using substances, right? Like what? What are some laws that we have that are very intentional about trying to separate people with addictions from other populations? Any thoughts? I know it takes you a second to go. Drug testing, that is a policy, right? And that is a very intentional one, right? Like, that is a policy that a lot of places, employers oftentimes have the drug testing policies. It's a structural system. When not only do they have it in employment, but in like places like Florida, for instance, oftentimes to receive government financial assistance, like through TANF or other things like that, oftentimes they have to take drug tests in order to show that they are sober. And so that is an example of that. And so there are very intentional, specific things that we do. If you start to look at specifically like laws that have been made in terms of the consequences, 65% of our prison population has been seen to be, it's estimated that 65% of our prison population has a substance use diagnosis. Some other estimates say it's a little bit lower than that, but it's at least 50%, between 50 and 65% of the people in our prison system have substance use diagnosis. If they don't have a diagnosis, oftentimes substance use was actually involved in some piece of why that individual is there. And so when we start to think about that, there is a structural kind of stigma that we have accepted, and that we now discriminate against when it comes to how we incarcerate people. The felony structure for substance use is often based on the acceptability of the substance itself, right? So what substances, for instance, are legal right now? What can you legally go out and use and it not be a problem? Marijuana, absolutely. And in our lifetime, we've seen that change, right? We've seen the stigma associated with the marijuana change. Opioids, if you're prescribed, yes. Alcohol, absolutely. How about cigarettes, tobacco, right? Nicotine, yeah. So there's a lot out there that we can use. Now, there's not as much stigma toward those substances as there is to others, unless they get out of hand, right? It's acceptable to use alcohol as long as you don't go overboard. But for other types of substances, opioids, it's acceptable if you are prescribed them and you're using them appropriately. It's acceptable to use Xanax or other benzodiazepines as long as you're prescribed them and you use them appropriately. Many people don't really know if you're not using them appropriately, but they know once the behaviors start showing up, right? And so we don't have a lot of tolerance for that. We say it's fine, you can go use these. Oh, but now you've crossed a line. Here's some behaviors that we don't like. And so, but when it comes to other substances, there's really not any appropriate amount that people are willing to allow. It's like you can't just run out and go use some cocaine, right? And people think you're cool. It's fine. Just don't let it get out of hand. Although we don't often say that to people. And so it's something to think about when it comes to our structural way of perceiving the different substances and how that then affects our laws. And again, we've seen this happen just in our lifetime with marijuana specifically, where it used to be, and it still is. The interesting thing about it is that from a federal standpoint, it still is a class 1, right? And so it's not like we can, it's a Schedule 1 substance still. It's completely illegal from a federal standpoint, but we've seen the perception of it change over time. People are not necessarily opposed to it the way that it used to be. And this also kind of is because of other biases that have happened in terms of populations that were using certain substances. Because of the perception of the drug, as because of the perception of the people that were using the substances, we ended up with a lot of structural laws that were put into place. Stigma. Then we also, and those were intentional. Other things that we've seen is health insurance parity. So there's been unintended consequences of this, right? Like, so in a lot of times, what you'll see is that health insurance pays differently for treatment when it comes to substance use versus mental health. And then those are also both very different. It used to be that they would be paid at a different rate for other medical conditions, right? How many times did you hear people who had addiction issues that weren't really seeking treatment because they couldn't really afford it? That happens a lot. And so there could be these unintended consequences when they have things like lifetime limits for individual, like in terms of how much they're going to pay. For an individual with some addictions, they might need to cycle through an inpatient rehabilitation facility multiple times, but they might not be able to get it paid for with their health insurance because of the limits that are associated with that. And that's not cheap, right? Like those things aren't cheap. And so these are some things to kind of that we need to be aware of. And to think about stigma. Stigma has been sanctioned because we do it from a structural level. We're like, oh, well, it must be bad because it's illegal. They must be a bad person because they did this. And then there's other things that we have legal restrictions on as well, right? Voting. When people come out of or when they come out of prison, for instance, and they've been in there because of, possession or whatever challenges that they've had regarding their substance use issue, they are limited to be able to vote, right? They are not able to vote if they've had a felony. And so that's something that we have these restrictions on, and it disproportionately affects people with substance use issues. Are not allowed to hold office if you have that, right? There's limits to the ability for people to actually hold an office. We also have restrictions on parenting. In some states, people can report parents if they are pregnant and under the influence of a substance. And in many cases, if the person if the mother, for instance, gives birth to a child that has the substance in their system, then that child can be taken away. And so we have structural laws put into place because we don't perceive that a person with an addiction can be a fit parent. And so these are things that we see pretty consistently, and we're okay with it. We look at these and we're like, oh, these laws are there for a reason. Does that mean that they're not there for a reason? Does it mean that all the behaviors of those individuals that are addicted to these substances have, that they should just be forgiven and they shouldn't even be an issue? No. I mean, there is behavior associated with addiction that is unfortunate, that should be, have consequences attached to it. But we make laws based on the fact that our perceptions that we have of people with substance use issues. Okay. Any questions, thoughts on this? Any other examples that you have about structural stigma that you can think of, maybe specific to your own state? Okay. You might be typing, so I apologize. So let's talk a little bit about social stigma, which oftentimes is what informs our public stigma, or informs our structural stigma. So our social stigma is what you all were talking about earlier, right? It's based on who do we blame for the condition. First and foremost, our stigma comes when we blame other people for it. And we say, you know what, or we blame the individual for what they've done. You did that to yourself. You made the choice to use a substance. You made the choice to keep going. I'm going to blame you. And so when we think it's somebody's fault, we tend to be okay with stigma or discriminating against them. Why would we feel bad for somebody when they put themselves in that situation? And many of you mentioned that earlier. And then we have stereotypes. So let's talk about some stereotypes. What are some things that you mentioned? Some of these earlier, where the example of like junkies, that they're lazy, things like that. But what are some other stereotypes of people who are addicted to multiple different types of substances? It could be alcohol, it could be marijuana, it could be cocaine. Give me some examples of some other stereotypes that you have, or that are held in public about people with addiction, depending on the substance or multiple substances. It doesn't really matter, but give me some more examples of your stereotypes. We had lazy, weak, things like that earlier. Rich people, yes, rich. It's like Xanax is the suburban mom drug, right? Like the white woman suburban mom drug. So yeah, there are stereotypes associated with certain prescription medications, and it's the rich people drug because they can keep getting it, right? Good. That's a great example. No intelligence, brain is burnt. Yes, that's a great example of a stereotype. The idea of a burnout, right? And it's interesting because there's a comedian by the name of Mitch Hedberg that has a joke where he says, alcoholism is like the only disease you can get yelled at for having, right? And so it's the kind of that same thing when we think about blame and we think about those stereotypes. It's like, dude, you're not very intelligent. You just keep burning out your brain with that weed or whatever it is you're looking at, right? So we have multiple stereotypes that are associated with it. Typically, in many cases, we think people are dangerous because they're using substances. We think that they're untrustworthy. We think that they're unpredictable. They have poor coping mechanisms. Great. And Lori is saying, let me kind of read this out loud so I can kind of process it as well. It says, just a thought, hard to reconcile inconsistencies. Alcohol abuse and food addictions often much more accepted, but very destructive. That is a great thought. And thank you for kind of bringing that up. We also, like for food addiction, for instance, we also have stereotypes about those individuals, whereas it's more accepted once it gets to that level, right? Like once it gets to that, like, unpleasant level, or when we like really start to separate people, it's not accepted anymore. We think that, there's poor self-control usually, right? Like, oh, you should be able to just stop eating. That shouldn't be a problem for you. So often we have these stereotypes and these perceptions of what each substance is. An alcoholic is lazy, selfish. An opiate addict is selfish and unwilling to change. You can't trust them because they're going to steal from you, or whatever the case may be. Oftentimes, when it comes to employment, what are some stereotypes that our employers might have about the people with addictions? They're not reliable. Yeah, they're probably not going to show up, right? What else? Safety hazard. Yes. Many employers seem to think that individuals with addiction are going to increase their workman's comp premiums. So very good. They believe that they're a safety hazard. Anything else? Thanks, Nicole. Any other thoughts? Other stereotypes that our employers have about people with addiction? Think about your clients. We talked about earlier, like they're lazy, right? Unhygienic, yeah. Potentially they also perceive that they would be using on the job, right? Like that they can't help themselves, and so they would just use constantly. And we need to think about this. We also risky behaviors, absolutely. They're probably, if they do that, they're probably going to do other things and get us in trouble at work. They probably might steal things from coworkers. And materials within they might steal things from the company. So we might steal time, right? Like, so we kind of have these perspectives. And one of the things that I would encourage you to think about is, from an employment perspective, what are some stereotypes you might still hold? What are, and we might, even after 10, 15, 20 years of working, we might still hold on to these stereotypes. And in fact, in some cases, our stereotypes actually get worse as we engage with a certain population. If we have it kind of justified, right? Like if we see behaviors that are consistent across individuals, sometimes our stereotypes might become more solidified in our perceptions. And so think about those and whether or not you have any that kind of stick out. Now, you don't have to tell us. I don't need to know that information. But we do have stereotypes with regard to that. Part of why this happens, obviously, is we don't have a lot of knowledge. There's not a lot of information that's out there about addiction outside of, we have the idea that alcohol is a disease. As I mentioned earlier, alcohol is the only disease that you can get yelled at for having, right? Nobody goes around saying, hey, stop having cancer. Why don't you just stop it? So, these are things that we need to kind of think about. From a knowledge perspective, knowledge do we have just out in the public about addiction? Is there any? What knowledge do you have? Like, outside of your professional experience, what knowledge do other people maybe in your life have about addiction? If they're not engaged in it themselves, that is. Any thoughts? Yes. So sometimes what some consider knowledge, others consider not factual, i.e., alcoholism is a disease. And that's a great point. When there is knowledge out there about it, we can also choose to not agree with that knowledge, right? And so when those facts are out there, sometimes they can say, I don't think it's a fact. I don't agree with it. And so the other piece about that is that sometimes knowledge changes, but what we accept within society about knowledge, or the knowledge, it takes time to catch up, right? And so knowledge is constantly happening. We're getting new and new information all the time about addiction, but it takes a long time to kind of get disseminated out into the public. And so many people don't have a lot of knowledge about how addiction works and what it looks like from person to person. And in many cases, people hide it extremely well too, right? Like if many people who have addiction are able to kind of keep it from family, friends, and things like that, because those family and friends don't have a lot of knowledge about addiction and what it looks like. And so when we don't have a lot of knowledge, the only information we're getting is from those negative perspectives. And typically that's coming from media, right? We oftentimes, again, as I mentioned earlier, we see in movies, we see in books, we see in news articles about the extreme behaviors of people with addiction. If we have no knowledge of it, we don't know anybody that has an addiction, which at this point in time is very rare, right? Like it's very rare that anybody has no knowledge or hasn't met anybody with an addiction. The problem with it is that if your interactions and known information about a person with addiction is negative, then you're not often going to change those perspectives. You're not going to be able to change those stereotypes if those interactions were negative. That's what our stereotypes are formed on, right? Like the only limited knowledge that we have coming in is negative, then that's what we're going to think it is. And so that's what we have to kind of counteract. A lot of what we have to change is how individuals with addiction are perceived in the media, as well as engaging and increasing contacts with individuals with addiction who are functioning, not those who are like needing a inpatient rehabilitation stay in order to come off of whatever substance they're on. Lori was saying often people don't care to seek knowledge about it when their perception is it's your choice, so just stop using. Absolutely. People don't really go out seeking it if they think, well, that's your problem. Often, if you think about like how we, even people with disabilities who maybe have acquired their disability because of an accident, if they got an accident because they were under the influence, even them being potentially like in a wheelchair based on that accident is not seen as the people are not generally as empathetic to those individuals because they believe they caused their condition, right? Like that because they were driving under the influence, for instance, and they got into that car accident, that's their fault. They got what they deserved, versus somebody who was a victim in that same car accident, right? So they'll have a little bit more empathy for that. And so if they think, hey, that's your fault, there's a lot less likely chance that they're going to really try to seek out positive images or positive knowledge about the condition, because why would they? Um, the other thing that we have to be careful of is that there is a stigma associated with different races, and it's based on ethnicity and culture as well. We see differences in terms of how we perceive substances based on who is using it. As I mentioned before, or let's talk a little bit, or let me find out a little bit from you all what you know about a lot of the substances that are on the scheduled class of substances that are illegal in terms of federal laws. What do you know about those and how they kind of became illegal? Any thoughts? Any historical perspectives that you know about? Just general knowledge that's out there about like maybe Freud and his cocaine and Coca-Cola having cocaine in it. Yeah, so it's interesting because there's some kind of little rumors about different people using substances history in the United States. But all these substances were legal for a long time. Cocaine was clearly legal. Freud was using it. They were using it in different things. They were using it in dentistry. They still do. But there's things, LSD helping artists in the 60s. Yeah, all of this stuff was pretty legal for a long time. A rope maker wanted marijuana illegal so they could make synthetic rope. Interesting. That's new to me. So that is oh, yes, instead of hemp. Yes. Great. So thank you for sharing those. One of the interesting things that has happened is that a lot of the substances and a lot of the stereotypes that have been associated with the substances has actually been based out of stereotypes that we had about the people using those substances. So, for instance, opiates came over from China very early on in the early 1900s or so, or late 1800s, early 1900s. And so, and we already had some kind of man-made things that were happening as well. But what ended up happening is when they were building the railroads in like the mid 1800s to late 1800s, what it was the Chinese population that was actually there kind of building those, and that they were like in all those like work camps and things like that. Well, they were using opiates, and because of that, there was a huge racial discrimination that was happening toward people who were Chinese. And so they decided, because those individuals were using so much opiate, specifically heroin at the time, they said, well, we can't have that. Heroin now is perceived as being very negative. We can't be using heroin because that's what those Chinese people use. The same thing happened over and over again with different substances. Marijuana was associated with people who were Mexican at the time. And so very early on in the early 1900s, there was a racial discrimination toward people who were of Mexican descent, and they were perceived as being marijuana users. So now marijuana is not perceived as being appropriate. That's where anybody, if you've ever seen that film Reefer Madness, where it was like a very propaganda kind of film that was kind of discouraging people from using marijuana because they would become delusional. That was happening because of perceptions toward individuals who were of Mexican descent. And so there was racial discrimination happening there. And so that transferred on to the substance itself because it was associated with those individuals. Cocaine was the same way. Often it was associated with people who were Black. And so then, as we see even now and up until very recently, many of our laws were actually harsher dependent on the substance itself. So cocaine, for instance, became illegal, but then the consequences for using powder cocaine were different from the consequences of rock cocaine. And so we saw that it was based again on who they perceived to be using that. Back in the 80s, powder cocaine was perceived to be the rich white person's drug, whereas rock cocaine was actually perceived to be the poor Black people drug. And so a lot of what we were seeing is that the way that we actually, the stereotypes and the stigma that we have associated with the substances themselves has actually been derived from the perception of the individuals who were using them. And so in the 70s, when we had the Comprehensive Control Act come into play in 1970, where it made all those drugs illegal, what was going on? What was happening at about that same time? Sorry, I know it's awkward as I wait for you to type. I just paused so that I give you a chance to type. But what was happening kind of in society in the US right before all of those substances became illegal with the Comprehensive Control Substance Act of 1970? The war. Yeah, the Vietnam War. People are coming back using a lot of heroin. What else? Any other thoughts? Because of the war, what was happening kind of from a social perspective? Yes. So a lot of what was happening was because of the civil rights movement in the 60s, there were a lot of people that were kind of raising up and coming against the government and saying, we don't want this. We want our perceptions to change. We need this, da 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 da. As a result, what ended up happening is that there were subgroups of people that were using a lot of things like LSD and other types of substances. And so what ended up happening was that because it was perceived that these individuals that were against the war, that were against discrimination for people, or for blacks, and were against discrimination for women and other parties, what ended up happening is that they were perceived as being the users of these substances. And so the laws came down to say that these now are illegal across the board, specifically to target the individuals that they perceived were using them. And so consistently throughout history in the United States, it's never really been necessarily the drug outside of alcohol. When we prohibited alcohol, it was always perceived that alcohol was the problem. But with everything else, it's never really been the substance. It was always kind of attached to the people who were using it. And as a result, that social stigma has been attached to every single substance, and it carries on with it throughout history. So let me move here. What can happen is that, unfortunately, that same stigma also follows around in families, right? These people are not immune. Just because it's your brother, just because it's your sister, does not necessarily mean that you're going to suddenly feel differently about the substance. Sometimes it does happen, but sometimes it doesn't. So sometimes what can happen is friends and family, all of these individuals can end up receiving stigma to them as members, as kind of a guilt by association, right? So family members will oftentimes end up experiencing stigma because they have a son or a daughter or a non-binary child who is engaging in substance use issues, right? And so those are some things to think about, is that when we're treating individuals or working with individuals who have substance use conditions, we're oftentimes thinking about how do we help that individual with their stigma, and their family members and the people that are close to them also are experiencing this stigma as well. But they also may be stigmatizing that individual. They may leave because those family members have public stigma, other types of public stigma. They said, you know what, you're kind of lazy, so I'm just not going to help you anymore. The other problem that we see oftentimes is that again, family members will experience stigma because of their association with the individual that has an addiction. Especially, like, I mean, give me an example that you can think of that a family member, things that friends or other family members might say to a parent, for instance, of someone who has an addiction. What might be something that you think they would say to each other? You didn't raise them right. Yep. Didn't raise them right. You did something wrong here. What else? Any other thoughts? Use tough love. Yeah. You throw them out of the house and they'll stop using. The only reason they're using is because you let them. Right? And so friends and acquaintances will oftentimes react very negatively and say those things to the family members, especially like when it's a parent. All of a sudden, people feel like they can all kind of like just say, hey, well, you're doing this parenting thing wrong. If you hadn't been so tough on them, if you hadn't been so easy on them, if you hadn't let them have anything they want, or if you hadn't been too strict, no matter what it is, there's always going to be the parents are going to be at fault for why the individual has a substance use condition, right? And then so the other thing that happens though is that still might be things that happen to the family, that they're dealing with both the consequence of the substance use, and then they also are experiencing some embarrassing things because of it. So if their house gets broken into by a family member that has an addiction, and they have stolen goods, they have to call the cops and go through this whole process. And it can be embarrassing for them to find out, or neighbors to find out, that it was a family member that did it. And so there's things that are associated with the illness. Overdoses, for instance, like I mentioned earlier, and I say this specifically, this example, because it was a perfect example of how media kind of portrays stigma in society, but it also gives you an insight into kind of the embarrassing episodes that happen for individuals. Now, there was, as I mentioned, a news article that kind of went viral a few years back, back in like probably I think it was like 2016 or so. And it was all on like social media everywhere, and everybody was posting how about these two parents that had overdosed in the front seat. The cops had taken a picture of the two parents that had overdosed in the front seat with a 3-year-old child in the back seat. The cops had posted it and posted it on their like Facebook account or something like that. And so, of course, that's a terrible image, right? Like two parents sitting in front of the seat, completely overdosed, and before they get their Narcan, they're just like slumped over and basically dead. And that's really embarrassing for that 3-year-old when she grows up and has to be reminded of this viral image of her parents when she was younger. And so this is something that happens a lot. And it has to, we have to be very cautious of when we're sharing these images and we're saying, yeah, exactly, that's exactly right. This is an embarrassment that can happen to that child later on in her life, because the parents were given Narcan right after the photo was taken, and they came out of it. They came out of the overdose, so they didn't actually die. Not before the damage was done, in terms of floating that image around just to scare people into not using substances. But that's where all of our stigma has come from, right? It's been used as a way to kind of control what people do. And so there is this also other aspect of it, of vicarious stigma, where people will begin to be rejected because, again, they're associated with an individual. Maybe your cousins don't come by anymore because your child has a disability or has a addiction or something like that. And so there's this stigma that happens even if you're not using, or even if you don't have that mental health condition, that it comes from other people because it looks like you did that or you were involved in some way. Another thing that happens, and we have to be very careful of this as professionals, is that oftentimes professionals can put stigma toward the family members because they view them as being at fault. Again, those using tough love, or you didn't raise them right, we're not immune to those thoughts as well, right? Especially when we see the parents interacting with the child. If we're seeing them kind of be very permissive, it's hard not to think, is this why, right? And so those things happen to us, and we have to be aware in those moments when we think of those things. Any questions or any examples that you guys in terms of family stigma, or any time that you've ever seen this happen to people? If you have, just feel free to write it in the chat. It doesn't have to be you. You can talk about other things. Now, the final kind of example of public stigma is going to be provider stigma. This is extremely common. People who are providers will also experience stigma toward individuals. Oh, here we go. Lori has a nice example here. It says, hard to balance the reality of actual behaviors, stealing, arrests, lies, unreliability, and balance that with not stereotyping and giving the person a fresh chance for change. Yes, must look at the whole truth. And she's speaking, she says, thank you for sharing that with us, Lori. She's speaking from experience with the niece that she has. And it's true. It's extremely difficult for the family to really be able to balance. How do you put that tough love in there? How do you put those, how do you make consequences for those negative behaviors that are a part of the illness without rejecting them and without being rejected yourself. And it's very challenging, very difficult to really be able to balance that. It's really challenging. So thank you for sharing that. And I appreciate you being vulnerable with kind of telling us about your experience with that. I appreciate that. So one of the things that happens with providers, and this happens in addictions counseling as well. I'm actually doing a study now to look at how do providers stigmatize the treatments that are available for addiction. And so one of the things that providers can do often is that they will dehumanize the individuals that have the addiction. For instance, how many times have you heard people say, I just work with addicts, or they're just a heroin addict, or they're a junkie, that one of you mentioned earlier in the chat. Oftentimes from this stigma perspective, providers will kind of separate the individual from themselves, and say, you know, you're very different. You're like not even human. Like I said earlier, often what can happen is when individuals work with people with addiction for a really long time and they start to see behaviors that are consistent over and over and over again, much like the family, as Lori was kind of indicating, is you'll see these negative behaviors over and over again. You'll start to see that those providers actually begin to dehumanize the person and say, you know what, you're not really the same because you're doing all these things. So even though we might have like 20 years experience, often what we see is over time, stigma actually increases for providers because of the interactions they have, because it's what we attend to. Often we're attending to those kind of negative examples and those things that are happening, like clients that quit their job because they relapsed over and over again, like those clients that just didn't go to work that day because they got high. Or those clients that don't return our phone calls because they're too busy getting high or whatever is going on. Often providers are really bad about this, but it's not just people in the mental health system, it's also in other medical fields. And it gets really bad when you step outside of the mental health field. So if you think that we're rough on being able to kind of maintain a good perspective toward individuals with addiction, physicians as well as other medical nurses, case managers, when they're not in specifically the mental health field, all of these professionals tend to have very negative perceptions about individuals with addiction. And this is compounded when the individual also has another stigmatized, such as HIV. So if you think about like intravenous drug users who might have acquired HIV because of their intravenous drug use, these folks are really looked down upon in the system. And oftentimes, what do you think that happen? What do you think will happen if we see this kind of provider stigma occurring all the time? What's going to happen for the individuals with addiction? Yeah, exactly. So yes, they're going to cease seeking treatment, less likely to seek treatment. They're not going to reach out for help. Yes, all of you are seeing that exact same thing very quickly. Why would you go to the hospital if you were overdosing if the last time the nurse called you a piece of crap who just doesn't care about anybody but yourself? Right? Now, nurses are amazing people and they oftentimes have the best bedside manner. But if they see the same person over and over again, they're coming in, while especially think about right now in this COVID experience, how do you think that might be affecting people with addiction? It is worsening. How so? I think it's worsening. Yes, they have less access to help because now that the systems are actually becoming overrun with COVID and depression, absolutely. Laura, you're absolutely right. The addiction itself and mental health conditions are absolutely increasing, and they're being kind of pushed off to the side. Now, when you think about if you have to prioritize somebody in a emergency room between somebody who's overdosing and somebody who has a breathing issue with regard to COVID, what do you think is going to happen? Typically, that person with the overdose is likely going to be pushed aside if you only have so many beds. Because right now, this person with the addiction seems to be the cause of their own problem, whereas this person with COVID is a public health emergency that is not to blame for their condition. And so this is one of the things that we're seeing is that providers are becoming less likely to seek help for fear of exposure. That's absolutely right. And more likely to be self-medicating when comorbidities exist. That is a great point. It's really challenging because if they come into an emergency situation, then it might be very possible that they will get in trouble for having been for using, especially when it comes to things like heroin and things like that. They don't want to get in trouble, especially if they have something on their system. There's a lot of individuals that will kind of just dump their friends if they were using and they overdose. They'll just dump them at the hospital and take off. Or if they do that at halftime, they just run away and don't even help the individual. And so the chance of being caught is very real fear for many individuals with addiction. And then, unfortunately, if they have some other type of addiction, if they're increasing their use, just as Paul is indicating, oftentimes that comorbid condition will also go downhill very quickly. And so this is something that is really creating problems and right now that's even worse essentially because of the public health crisis that we seem to be in. But providers are very open and willing to acknowledge that they will push someone aside that is perceived as having an addiction versus those individuals that need the help, so they say. I've personally seen the lack of empathy or concern for a person that overdosed by emergency room staff. That's amazing. That is so unfortunate, right? I mean, it's kind of scary to think about. Like, again, addiction's the only disease that you can really be yelled at for having, that you can get in trouble for having, right? And so it's something to really kind of think about. And that's really unfortunate, Nicole. I'm sorry you had to have that experience where you saw that. It's very challenging. It's not providers that deal with it. Again, we're talking about that these providers like emergency room doctors or physicians that see people who keep coming back because of conditions that are made worse by their substance use, such as liver disease or liver failure. And you think about that, right? Like there are restrictions on transplants for anybody that's ever used substances. Like they aren't allowed to use substances at all. If they and if they did at any point, they're much lower on the transplant list a lot. But oftentimes, like if they have like liver disease and they continue drinking, doctors often don't want to help them because it's like, you know, the problem and you have this medical condition that is being made worse by your alcohol use. This is a problem. I'm not going to serve you. Or at the bare minimum, I'm not going to provide you with empathy, as Nicole was talking about. And so often you'll hear this, you'll hear those labels, right? Addict is the most common. Typically, that's what we refer to them as is, oh, they're an addict. They're pretty useless right now, or they're a junkie, or they're a wino, or whatever labels that we use, but they're usually derogatory, right? What other types of derogatory labels have you heard of with regard to addicts? It could be substance specific addicts too. What labels have you heard? Yeah, criminal, right? Huge association between addiction and crime. And so like we said, 65% of the prison system is filled up with individuals that have some type of, I apologize, I'm trying to look at, okay, sorry, I was looking. Uh-oh. Sorry, guys, I think my internet was kind of going a little wonky. Apologize. But yes, there's a huge association between the perception that people who are using are also criminals, right? So good. Part of what we need to look at is how are these individuals being discriminated against in the medical setting? We need to talk with them through that as well. One of the other things that happens is that providers will then infantilize them, right? Will actually make decisions for them because we feel like they can't make their own decisions because they've made bad decisions in the past. I would encourage you to think a little bit about your self-assessment earlier. And sometimes we can feel like we're doing good for the clients. And this is true for like abilities, right? Like we were taught about this in grad school where, you know, we have to be very cautious that we're not internalizing our clients. But it happens a lot for people with addiction, more so because what it ends up happening is that if a person is not completely sober, they end up being perceived as not being able to make their own choices. Remember, if they're under the influence, then technically, cognitively, they're not at, they don't have the capacity to make their own choices in those moments. And so often, I think providers tend to use that as an opportunity to do things for them. And then sometimes it's out of actual positive desire to help, right? So many times it's like, okay, well, they keep using, and so they keep picking job goals that aren't appropriate for them. So I'm just going to find a job that they can go to because of their criminal background and, you know, doesn't have a lot of expectations for them. So many times we don't give them a lot of choices. We might say, and I say this again from seeing it happen a lot in my own office, and maybe it hasn't happened in yours, but and hopefully it hasn't. But in some cases, we'll see where people will have like a person with an addiction choosing their job goal, and they might say things like, well, I really want to become a therapist. And that's a really common thing, right? Like it's from people with addiction. Oftentimes they want to come back and give back to the field. They say, I want to become a therapist. They've had maybe 2 weeks sobriety and they want to change their whole life around. Oftentimes we might say, okay, well, we'll see about that. And maybe we'll give them choices that are very limited. Say, you know, let's look at your history. Let's look at this. And we'll kind of focus in on those negative behaviors and the negative aspects and the reason that people can't be successful rather than focusing in on how they might be successful. And then another way that we often do this is if we limit who we're referring them to based on what we know, like maybe we have a good relationship with a certain work adjustment training job coach or something, and we're like, oh, I don't want to saddle this client or that particular provider with this client who keeps being relapsing over and over again, who's been on my caseload 20 times, and I don't want to punish them by giving them this client, so I'll send them over somewhere else. And so oftentimes this is what can happen. Also, it'll be a lot of talking down to the client. And in many cases, it might be very lowered expectations for what you expect from them. And so if we think that the person is going to relapse continuously, then we're not going to expect that they're going to be very successful. And so we don't want them to aim high if we don't think and that this would be appropriate, right? So I apologize. Give me 1 second. Oh, sorry about that. thing was going out. I just wanted to make sure I didn't lose my connection there. I apologize. But oftentimes we will lower our expectations if we see a cycle of relapse, for instance, and we may say, you know what? And I saw this happen. Like an example that I have from my own practice was when our counselors would actually send people to one specific car wash in the community. They said, you know what? That's all they can really work at is this guy hires ex addicts, so that's just where I'm going to send them for a job. So lowered expectations as well as limited choice, and not really giving the client an opportunity to really be involved in their job prospects. And so it happens from multiple perspectives. It can happen from us as the rehab counselors or the vocational evaluators, even as we're kind of going through it and we're thinking of different job goals and things like that. And so we have to be very cautious of that as we go through that process. Now let's move into talking a little bit about self-stigma. So all of this stigma is happening outside of the individuals. This is how society perceives everything we've talked about up to this point is how like society tends to perceive stigma as well. Then what happens is the individual themselves also experiences self-stigma. And this happens in three different ways. There's an enacted stigma, there's anticipated stigma, and there's internalized stigma. Enacted stigma is actually that stereotyping and discrimination that the individual has experienced. What examples do you have from the field, if you do, of your clients having this enacted stigma of experiencing this stereotyping and discrimination? That's definitely part of that internalized stigma. Absolutely. They feel like no matter what they do, or how hard they try, they will fail. And what's that based on, though? Because that comes after over time, right? Like, so that perception tends to come over time. It doesn't usually happen like, yes. So that's usually what happens is the way that they are treated from others, they begin to internalize that over time. From an enacted stigma perspective, this is where that stereotyping and discrimination happens when they lose out on jobs, right? Like when they don't they apply for jobs and they tell somebody about their addiction and then all of a sudden they don't get a call back, right? So those are things that you might see. Does anybody have any examples that they can think of that their clients have experienced, like discrimination or stereotyping about their condition? And I mean, it's okay if you don't. I just didn't know if you had any good examples that you'd like to talk about. And feel free to type that in, and I'll attend to it when it comes in. But part of what happens is that if that continues to happen, if you hear a lot of times left out of family events and relationships, yeah, that's really hard for people to deal with, right? Like being completely left out of family events, being discriminated against in your own family, and being stereotyped, having an experience. Also, there's a vicarious one, right? Like, so if all they see are images, like we talked about earlier in the media, of negative perspectives of people with addiction, what's going to happen, right? Typically they're going to internalize that and be like, oh, that's about me. If they're seeing other people be discriminated against, then they're going to assume that that's going to happen to them, and that leads to anticipated stigma. When people experience a lot of stereotyping or discrimination, saying you're not going to be a fit mother if you keep using, then there's going to be, that leads to often an anticipated stigma, so that they actually expect stereotyping and discrimination. So going back to what Anita said earlier, where they feel like no matter what they do or how hard they try, they're going to fail. That's when they internalize that stereotyping and discrimination, right? And so they have it experienced, they have experienced it in the past. Then they actually begin to anticipate that they're going to experience it, and so they don't try. In many cases, it's like, well, the employers aren't going to care anyway. They're going to not hire me. They're going to accuse me of stealing or what have you. So that's what I expect if I go in there and apply to this job. That's what I expect if I disclose my disability. Now, at this point, you can have clients that have experienced stigma and have experienced anticipated stigma, so that they expect the discrimination is going to happen, and they have had discrimination happen potentially. But you might have the client might not actually have internalized stigma, depending on their own level of resiliency, where they are in treatment. It doesn't necessarily make a difference. Sometimes people can actually have or get away with not having internalized stigma. And so let's talk a little bit now about what it would look like if somebody is experiencing internalized stigma. So Anita gave a good example where they feel like no matter what they do or how hard they try, they're gonna fail. So what does that usually look like in terms of behaviors? So if somebody is kind of having all of this, what kind of behaviors might you see in the counseling relationship? A lack of trying. Just may not really fill out any job applications. They may not come to your appointments. What else? Little or no self-confidence or self-esteem. That's true. You might see that they just don't believe in themselves. No communication, right? They might just ghost you. Like you might be trying to contact them and they just may not call back. Yeah, no self-respect, no self-esteem. And what kind of behaviors do you see when people don't have self-respect and have very limited self-esteem for themselves? What do they do behaviorally oftentimes? Nothing. They may not participate and they may not come to appointments. They may not be a part of the process. Um, so if you're doing like a planning, an IPE planning, you might not really get any participation from them. They'll just be like, okay, 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 I guess so, whatever. How about on the flip side? What if they do something? What happens? Yes, they will say they'll do something and then they just don't, right? Like they don't follow through. Delay of completing life steps like getting their driver's license, getting the GED, finishing tasks, or they do it poorly. That's a great idea, is that there is a lot of self-sabotage that happens for people that have internalized stigma. That's a really good example. So typically, what we will see is that they become disengaged in the counseling process. They begin to engage more in their substance use behavior because of the guilt. Quite frequently, it's a huge risk factor for relapse. And then you'll oftentimes see that they start engaging in other risky behaviors. How many of you have had the experience that you had a client on your caseload that was engaged in like substance use and maybe you're working on it and then you go to call them and you find out that they've been either violated on their parole and now they've been sent back to prison, or got in trouble for the first time and now they're in jail? Quite frequently, people who are engaging in or who have internalized stigma will engage in other risky behaviors. They might end up having like other diseases or disorders because of behaviors that they engaged in because of this internalized stigma. Oftentimes, they'll be when we have this type of stigma as well, often they're not going to seek out treatment, as we talked about earlier. If they feel like nothing is going to help them, why would they go look for help? That wouldn't make any sense, right? You also want to make sure that they have, or the other things that you might see is that they have, besides a lack of participation, they have negative outlook on their actual job goals or things like that, right? They may come dressed poorly, like somebody mentioned earlier, being not as hygienic. So they might show up of not being, their hair kind of might be a mess. They might have shoes that have holes in them or other things like that. Those self-sabotaging behaviors. There you'll oftentimes see that this lack of engagement and this challenge in the process when people are feeling like it doesn't matter. People are going to discriminate against me. People think that I am a certain way. And then they oftentimes will engage in the behaviors that they're being stereotyped as doing. And so if they think that somebody expects them to rob and steal their neighbor, they may go ahead and rob and steal their neighbor, because what difference does it make? People expect me to do it anyway. So one of the things that we have to look for in when we're working with somebody with an addiction is, how do we actively try to reduce our own stigma? We have to think a little bit more about our own beliefs as we go through this process, and how is stigma impacting our relationship? Let's have a little conversation about this right now. Let's talk about, how do you think in your counseling relationships stigma can impact your relationship? Personal biases may have an effect, negative or positive. Right. Can you give me like an example maybe? That's fine. Take your time. I want us to think for a minute anyway about how our counseling alliance can be disrupted if we are having our own biases and our own stigma associated with it. Now, we like to think, I believe, that we're very open and willing to kind of accept everybody, and that type of thing, but sometimes it doesn't really lead to that. We can still be we can still have our own biases. I'm sorry. Anita said, subconsciously a person may try harder or less hard to help those who may be involved in our biases. That's a great example. So quite frequently, what we might see is that individuals who are, if we have stigma within our counseling relationship, it might influence how we interact with the individual, right? And so this is something that we have to be cautious of. If we think, for instance, that here goes Tommy again. He is back in my office and has relapsed for the third time. I'm tired of trying to find him a job that he just ends up walking away from. I'm tired of him burning these bridges for my employers when I've worked so hard to engage with them. And now look what they're thinking of him. Like, oh, they think that I am useless because of this. And so, I just don't know how much more I can put into my relationship with him, right? I mean, think about that. Because many of you probably have clients that come back through the door multiple times. And if they came back through the door because of losing a position to their own doing, as is often perceived by people with addiction, think about how you kind of react to that. Every time, do you look at it as a opportunity to look for new ventures for the client, or do we kind of have that little bit of a again, like thinking about that and how does that impact it? We also like to think that we have this really kind of open perspective, right? Like, oh, I know about working with people for years on who have addiction, and so I'm so open and willing to like work with them. I want you to be really honest with yourself, because one of the things that we actually see with and I want to make it very clear that in no way am I, when I say this, am I like being negative about anybody's level of experience. But one of the things that we've seen in research consistently over and over again that is that the relationship with the client is not impacted in any way, shape, or form by counselor experience, meaning that we don't get better. Our relationships with our clients don't get better just because we've been doing it for a really long time. It's actually kind of interesting, right? Because you would expect like, oh, I get better, so I would do better, and the clients would feel more secure with me because of my experience. That may be true to a certain level, and actually what they've found is that up to about 6 months postgraduate training, counselors actually do get better in general. But what we also see is that there's actually a flat line in terms of how well or how many skills we actually increase when we go with more experience. One of the things that comes into play and that we tend to rely heavily on is our experience, something called clinical judgment. So our clinical judgment usually comes because of our experience mixed with like our knowledge and other things that we have put into our counseling relationship. One of the interesting things about counseling or clinical judgment is that oftentimes it's wrong. The research that we do over and over again to look at clinical judgment has said that oftentimes the more experience that a person has, the more they rely on their clinical judgment, which means what? If we're relying on our clinical judgment a lot because we have a lot of experience, what do you think might happen? This is really basic. I mean, I may not have even asked this question the best way, but the things that you think about that might happen is that we could be wrong, right? Like we might be very wrong about how we think we are doing. And so often our clinical judgment, again, is based on our own personal experiences. And so if we're only basing it like on our experiences, yes, our assumptions might be made rather than using the individual's experience. That's a great example, Anita. Might make assumptions about the experience or about what's going to happen with the client based on having worked with clients that had similar histories in the past. Now, that works in some cases, right? Like you can write a treatment plan or you can write an IPE very quickly because you have experience and you can rely on that experience to get it done quickly. But that's what we do, right? The reason that we get more efficient as we get more experience is because we begin to compartmentalize and we categorize things. And our brain just becomes very efficient in terms of how we do things because we can't just be using the same amount of time all the time on these tasks. And so what ends up happening is that our clinical judgment, we think we're relying on something that's a really efficient machine, but really what we're relying on is our catalog of how we've put information away over the years. And so sometimes we might go back to that information and it might be assumptions that we made like a long time ago. So one of the things that we have to be careful about is that we actually do have to kind of question our own assumptions and our own beliefs kind of consistently. There's something called confirmation bias. And what ends up happening and what we've seen in the research is that the more that we rely on our clinical judgment, the more that we actually fall victim to this confirmation bias, which means that we actually are looking for evidence to show us what we think is true. So if we think, for instance, that Alex is lazy and has not been doing his weight in his job, has not been pulling his weight on his job, then we'll go to a job site to do a job site visit, and we'll say, "Oh, look at this. He hasn't done this. He hasn't done that. I see this over here that he hasn't done," but we're not going to attend to the things that Alex has been doing. Lori says, for me, it's crucial to stay present. Yes. Observe, listen, consider their specific personal story. When I mess up, I rely on my knowledge and systems too much. That's a great, thank you for being vulnerable and sharing that information, Lori. I appreciate that. It's true. We do tend to kind of rely on what we know and the system that we work in because that's what we know. It helps us. And it's not to say, again, that it doesn't serve a purpose. And it's not to say that you're all terrible because you have all this work experience. No, not at all. But what it does mean is that we have to be a lot more active in ensuring, like Lori is talking about, being present. And we have to be very conscious about whether or not we're doing that. And we have to kind of consistently reflect on any of those perceptions that we have about the client, especially those with addiction that maybe are kind of engaging in those same similar behaviors. So I have a case study, and we're going to come back to this in just a minute. But we'll talk about it in just a moment. This is very interesting because my slide is actually kind of wonkadoodle. Again, it does not look the same on mine as it did once I shared it, so that's kind of interesting. So what I want to share with you now, and I'm not entirely sure. I'm going to try this. So if it doesn't quite work, let me know. I'm going to try, but we'll see if it doesn't work or does. I don't know. Let me see real quick. How do we do this? How do we reduce our own stigma in our counseling relationship? The first thing is our exposure, right? Like this is kind of something that's consistent across the board with reducing stigma in the community is we need exposure. We need more and more exposure to people with addictions. So give me 1 second. I'm going to try and share this video with you because I feel like this was a really neat video that really kind of gets us in their perspective. And so give me one moment. What I'm going to ask you to do is I'm going to share the link of this video in the chat box, and I would like for you to go ahead and because I can't actually get it to work here in this slide part, and so I'm going to put this in the chat box, and if you can do me a favor and kind of open your own window and watch this video independently, and then type in the chat box when you are done. And for people who are not participating, I'm going to try and actually share the screen. But sometimes what happens with my with the headset that I use, oftentimes I can't you can't hear it, and so that's one of the reasons that I'm sharing it in the chat box. I'm going to try and share it in the presentation, but because of the headset that I use, oftentimes I can't. So I'm going to try it here, and let's see if this works. Let me know if you probably can't hear this, but can you hear this? Were you guys able to hear that at all? Oh, you could. Okay. So so one person's saying no. Nicole's saying no. Anita and Christina are saying, and Lori's saying no. Okay. That's interesting. All right. So what I'm going to have you do is I'm going to have you on the link that I just sent, and I would like for you to go ahead and watch that video kind of on your own, and then type in the chat box when you're finished. Just say done. Okay, I see you guys trickling in saying that you were done, a couple of you. Right. Wonderful. So tell me what you thought about that video. Nicole is very done. Tell me what you thought about that video. What are some things that kind of came up for you when you were doing that, when you were watching it? That's okay, Nicole. Anita says, it makes me sad, angry, ashamed that our society treats people that way. It is sad, right? How deeply it affects people being discriminated against. Absolutely. I mean, and you think about some of the examples that they gave, right? Like, I mean, you're talking about going into a store and like kind of being followed all the time. We hear about this for other populations as well, and it's this kind of being untrustworthy thing again. And Peggy says, I think it would be a very lonely life and makes you feel cut off. Absolutely. And so often what makes sense for this individual whose coping mechanism is to return to the substance, if that's how they're feeling, why would they stop? Is they can trust their drug to treat them appropriately, right? They know every time they use what that drug is going to do to them. But people out in the community, they don't know how that's going to experience, how they're going to experience that. And so to reduce stigma, not just for others, but for ourselves, if we kind of increase also our exposure to those individuals and our positive experiences as well, it oftentimes will reduce our own biases that we have. Seeing people be successful oftentimes can help us to reduce that bias. The other piece about it is that we need to get more knowledge. One of the biggest reasons that we have stigma, as we mentioned very early on in the presentation, is that people just don't have a lot of knowledge about it, right? And so while we might think we have a lot of knowledge, we might still only have limited knowledge about it. And so it helps us to go ahead and get more information about the condition. Right? Like if you are working with somebody that has a cocaine addiction, and it's the first time that you've worked with somebody with such a with that particular drug, then you might need to get more knowledge and information about how that drug works in their system. I have another video that kind of demonstrates how a person that has an addiction can use knowledge as well to help individuals. So I'm going to show you another one. Again, it's about the same length as the one that you just did, but I'm going to share with you. Miranda says, it made me sad at how they were treated. It also reminded me to make sure I check myself outside of my professional setting and don't treat people the same way. And that is a great point, Miranda, because oftentimes we kind of put on our professional hat when we walk into the office and we think, we've removed all of our biases because we've put on our professional hat and we walked in the office. But then we have a different persona outside of the office, potentially, where we kind of think differently about addiction and we think differently about those poor sats who overdosed in the front seat of their car, leaving their 3-year-old in the back seat to fend for herself. We might have a different perspective of those fleeting images that we see on Facebook or on Twitter or what have you. And so reminding ourselves to check kind of our bias when we get into the setting is extremely important. And so that's a great point. I'm going to share this other video here in the chat box. And again, if you'll just take a gander at it and let me know in the chat box when you are finished with that video. All right, good. I see some of you are finishing up. Great. So what did you get from this particular video? What were your thoughts on this one? Oh, there's hope. We can all be part of the solution. That's a good point. What else? Any other thoughts? And I know it takes a bit to type your responses, and that's fine. And so while you continue to type your responses, I'm going to go ahead and kind of just share a little bit about why I shared this video with you. Again, part of what one of the things that we see, we talked about internalized stigma earlier. Knowledge is going to help in terms of reducing the stigma, not just from our perspective as the professional, but from the client's perspective as well. Right. So one of the things that we can also help with in terms of increasing or reducing the stigma and increasing our counseling alliance is to provide information when we can. If there's something that we have more knowledge about, then we can share that information with them, such as it's not your choice. And that could be helpful in reducing that guilt and that internalized stigma that the client is experiencing. And so those are some things to really kind of think about. But knowledge, and like Anita said, we can all be part of the solution. I would like to know, Anita, what do you mean by that? How did this video kind of tell you that? What was something you were thinking specifically? And I know it'll take you a second to respond or in there, but um, you can use your own power to speak up. Yes, so advocacy as well. So communicating knowledge to employers, for instance, is also another way that we can kind of help reduce stigma. It might not affect the counseling relationship immediately, but it will long term, because the more that we are getting out and actually advocating and saying, providing knowledge about addiction and what that looks like for the clients that we're working with, quite frequently we can end up bringing that kind of perspective back to our relationship with our clients, right? And so we would more than likely have a much more positive perspective as we're working with them. We're not going to attend to those negative behaviors that we had seen previously. So knowledge is extremely important. And then the next piece of this is for us to become very aware. As many of you have mentioned, and I believe it was, I may have this wrong, and I can scroll up to see, but I think, yes, Lori had said earlier, being present. And so that's one way to have awareness in the moment in your relationship with your client. Being aware and being very intentional about looking for those things that you might be doing that has that bias on the individual, and those thoughts that kind of come up and float in your consciousness as you are um, talking to the client and they're telling you about these behaviors that they've engaged in. If there's those little floating thoughts that happen that come in from the outside, as I think Laura talked about earlier, that whole, or maybe it was Anita, and I apologize if I'm getting you guys wrong. Oh, it was Miranda. I'm sorry, Miranda. But as Miranda was saying earlier, that ability to kind of check ourselves at the door, but it's not even really about putting it outside the door, right? Because it means that you're putting it back on when you leave the door, right? And so it's not a hat that we just kind of take off. I mean, it's about being truly aware about our own experiences, and we have to be aware in that moment and assess our biases about addiction specifically first. And again, one of the reasons that I wanted you to take that self-assessment at the very beginning, because I want you to think about that and be aware, as honest as you can be to yourself and about yourself, in that moment. Again, I don't get those results. I specifically said, don't send me those results. I don't want them. It's just for you to kind of be aware and honest with yourself, because you need to increase your own awareness. Everybody does. I do this for, I do nothing but talk about like stigma and how it relates to people with addiction. And I can find myself while I'm watching a news story go, oh, I can't believe that they did that. Right. And so like we all are always very aware of our biases, or we should always be aware of our biases and how that's coming into play, because that's going to impact our counseling relationship as well as what we offer to the client. We talked earlier about how provider stigma can get in the way of the counseling relationship and how it can limit what we do for the individual. It's not to say that you're always going to do that and that that's something that, you are just absolutely going to do because you're not being aware. Um, it's oftentimes very subtle as part of the challenge, is that we often aren't recognizing it in the moment because it's subtle. And so we have to be very intentional of how aware we are. The other thing that we have to be careful about is not only are we assessing our biases with regard to addiction, but we also have to assess our biases related to other things outside of the addiction. For instance, do we have biases against certain racial groups? As this individual in the first video that we watched had indicated, she said, I'm Native American, and so they think because of my darker skin color, I'm going to steal. And so think about that from a perspective, from your own perspective, are there some biases that you hold that are outside of addiction, that are unrelated to that, and that are also interfering with your assumption about the person because of their addiction, if that makes sense? So is there something that you associate addiction with outside of the clinical relationship, and it's not just addiction, but you're actually responding to other biases and not the addiction itself? So do you have biases about people in different ethnic groups? You have biases about people's political choices? You have biases about the what people choose to spend their money on, things like that. So anything kind of out there outside of it, but could eventually be tagged and connected back to the addiction, assess that pretty regularly to kind of be aware of things that you might be experiencing in terms of a bias. The other thing that you can do is, and I know many of us have been in the field for many, many, many years, and we have our licenses, and we've been doing this so long that we oftentimes might not even think about supervision. But sometimes it would be very helpful if you have the opportunity to actually get supervision, even if you're fully licensed or you don't actually need it for any specific reason. Finding a supervisor that you can actually communicate these things to and assess your own skills and what's going on and how that might be interfering with the counseling relationship is going to be very important. If you're finding, for instance, that you're not having a lot of success with a certain type of client pretty regularly, it'd be helpful to go out and seek supervision to begin to assess some of the things that might be going on and what you might be bringing into the session. You also could do some live supervision potentially in order to help have a second pair of eyes to see if there's anything happening in the room. Is there behaviors that the client is demonstrating toward you that indicate they're experiencing some internalized stigma that you're not picking up on? It doesn't necessarily mean that you're doing anything wrong. It's more about, we have all these peers, we have all these people that have as much experience and knowledge as we do. We should use them to help us begin to assess ourselves on a regular basis. And so it doesn't have to be like somebody who has more experience. It doesn't have to be somebody that is in a management supervisory position. It could just be a colleague and say, I'd really like you to take a look at session or sit in on this session with me because I'm really struggling with this client and I want to help them, and I don't know if it's something that is I'm doing that I'm not seeing. You know, these are opportunities for growth that I would encourage as we begin to kind of assess ourselves and being honest with where we are and how we perceive people with addiction. Any questions about like the material? We're going to go into and do some breakout groups if it works. And I'm going to have you do a little bit of activity with a case study here that I have created. But does anybody have any questions about the material or anything that we've talked about up to this point? Or comments too. Thank you. I appreciate that, Anita. I'm glad you found it useful. Okay, I'm going to, good. I'm glad it was helpful. I'm glad that you found it to be useful and it was something that was, you feel like you're going to be able to use it. I'm going to try and move you all into in a couple breakout rooms. And what I'm going to ask you to do, and I'm going to put this information into I think I'll put it into your chat box because you can't see the entire, I'm going to put the last paragraph of the case study. Looks like that it cut off. And so I'm going to put the last paragraph of the case study in the chat box of your groups. And so I'm going to send you over into your groups. And what I'd like for you to do is I want you to read through this case study together. And then I would like for you to talk amongst yourselves about three things. One, I want you to look at all the things that you would attend to from your clinical judgment that would tell you that the client might struggle. Then I want you to attend to the things on the flip side that from your clinical judgment that would tell you that the client would be successful. I want you to look together and talk together about things that you feel like you could do in the session to reduce the stigma that might be coming in between you and the client. Okay. And I'll put that again in the chat box in your groups. I think you guys might have individual groups as well. Let me see here. Right, I'm going to do this, and hopefully this works the way I think it should. So you guys are going to be sent over your groups now. And there's only two groups. One has 6 members, the other one has 5. Just so it can be a little bit of one of them only has 4 now. So we will, I'm going to actually move a couple people around. Let's see. Just so we can make it a little bit more even. Okay, that looks about right. I am going to send folks over now. Who do I have by? I realize the person that's on the phone can't be thrown into a group chat, or you can't be put in a breakout room, so you might be missing out on part of the activity. So I wanted to kind of get you to talk to me here through it. All right. Oh, okay. I'm hearing some folks can see each other. They can't see the case study when you go into your breakout room. Okay, so let me do this. I'm going to print the case. I'm going to copy the case study into the chat, and then you should be able to see that. Good point. Okay. Well, if you guys can hear me, I'm not sure you can, but if you can hear me right now, when you are able to, I'm going to put the case study in the chat box so that you can read it there if you can't see it. And then also, if you'll come back to the main room at about from your time, I think it would be 12:45. So if you could come back to the main room and close out your group in about 10, maybe 15 minutes. And so I'll put the case study in the chat so you can see that. I'm not sure if you guys can all hear me. um, but it sounds like some folks have forgotten a little bit about what we needed to discuss as part of that assignment, and that is just fine. So I'm gonna type it into the chat box, at least the first thing, real quick. Just as an FYI, I know we got a late start, but I'm about to close out the breakout rooms and have folks come back in. But it looks like I'm getting both of them anyway, so I'm going to close those out in just one more minute. All right, I'm about to bring folks in into the main room once more, and your breakout sessions are ending. All right. So I ended everybody's breakout sessions. I hopefully that I know that it takes so long to read through that case study that it can be kind of hard to have those discussions or have enough time to have the discussion as well. So I apologize if you didn't get to discuss it a lot. But what were some things that you thought about? I know there was some forgetting of the original instructions, and that's okay. But what what is one thing that you felt that you went into that would kind of tell you that he would not be as successful as the client? What's one thing that you probably would attend to? If you guys want to give me an example of something that you might have attended to that would tell you that he wasn't going to be successful. I think I saw some in there. Poor personal hygiene, lack of eye contact. Okay. And that kind of takes us somewhere, right? Like in our head, when we see like poor personal hygiene, lack of eye contact, these are social expectations that we have. And if he's not engaging in these behaviors, then he's a lot likely to be successful in this, right? And so that's a good point. And we have to be aware, like, we're working with the client, are we attending to those negative things? Are we focusing on those behaviors because we kind of expect that from him being a drug addict, right? And so those things that we need to think about, and we need to be very intentional of being in the moment and saying, am I just paying attention to the fact that he's dirty right now because of that's what I expect of him? What am I noticing? And am I seeing this in a helpful way? Am I saying, oh, I might need to help him get some new interview clothes? Or am I making other negative assumptions about it? What's happening? So figuring out what we are attending to in order to, or that we think might mean that the client's not going to be successful. Because when we see a person coming in that we know has served time for cocaine and marijuana possession, we kind of already have some red flags up. Like we have some perceptions that are already kind of percolating in there. And then when he comes in dressed as he does, it makes sense that we might start to attend to those negative things because we're already having those negative thoughts back there. And so then if you think about it from the other side, what are some things that you could attend to that would tell you that he is going to be successful? Yeah, he obtained his GED, right? He showed up, right? Absolutely. Like he's there. He's kind of a mess and he doesn't really seem like he wants to be there, but he is there. And so we can work with that, right? And so there is reason to believe that showed up to our appointments, he's going to show up for work, right? And so we need to attend to those things that we feel like are going to be successful for the client, and be intentional about what is it that we're seeing that is helping us. It makes sense that over time, as we have worked a lot with clients and see the same kind of behaviors over and over again, it would make sense that we might kind of start zeroing in on all those like problem behaviors, right? Because it's easy and efficient. That's what we do. That's how our brain compartmentalizes and makes things quicker. But we have to be more intentional about focusing on those things that are really the successes and the strengths that the client is bringing into the room in that moment to reduce our own biases. Because when we have those biases, we're going to focus on those negatives. And so if we can begin to focus on those other things, like while he got that GED, while he was incarcerated, he really he used his time to increase his, to improve himself in some way. So I wonder what else he do to improve himself after he leaves here, or working with me. What can he do? And so he also has a good home set up, right? He has a place to live right now. And so that can be really helpful in looking for employment. And if he has a stable home to live in, that's going to alleviate some of that stress. So those are some things that he's bringing to the table. Now, what are some things that, or how do you think some of these biases might affect your relationship, Jeff? I know I read some of them earlier because I think I'm not sure how it went, but like Anita was suggesting that she'd seek help from coworkers who might have better insight because maybe she doesn't really have a lot of knowledge in that area or ability to work with those clients. So that was a good suggestion there. She said that it might cause her to hold back in the counseling relationship. What else? What are some other things that you feel like how would this bias and those things, those negative things that we're attending to, how would that affect our relationship with the client, with Jeff? Important to always be looking for the whole story, the whole truth. Hygiene, not just connected with substance use. Is it poor home condition, lack of instruction, resources, depression? Absolutely. Always be looking for explanations for those behaviors. If you do notice those behaviors, rather than kind of saying, ugh, he doesn't really care about his appearance, or he's really caring more about his substance use. What other things are going on? Is it because he doesn't have any resources? He just get out of prison, right? And so that's something to think about. How might you improve your relationship with him if you feel like you're kind of focusing on these negative things and this poor hygiene, the fact that he just has a kid and leaves them and doesn't have anything to do with them. How do you think this is going to affect your relationship with the client? And I know some of you are probably typing or writing, and so I don't want to like cut you off. But I want you to think about this as you kind of go forward: is how are we going to make sure the client will likely have a feeling if the therapist or counselor is holding back, or if there's a lack of unconditional positive regard. That's absolutely right, Anita. The client is going to be able to sense if you're as kind of resistant in that moment as he is, right? If he comes in and kind of throwing his eye contact up to the ceiling, and he senses from you that kind of what is going on, and likely that's going to impact the relationship that he has. The sharing that he does with you is going to be impacted. The honesty that he provides is likely going to be impacted. And so in order to kind of reduce that for ourselves, we do need to, he may feel judged. Yeah, that's a point. In order to help ourselves with that, we need to be able to attend to those things that we think are going to that are telling a different story, that are changing our biases, attending to those positives, not attending to the problems. And so, any thoughts, questions? We're kind of getting to the end here, but any other comments, either a case study, what you might do with Jeff, or any overall questions or comments about the presentation in general? And I know somebody had mentioned in the beginning that they wanted more resources. And this presentation, to be honest, wasn't really intended like provide resources necessarily for like treatment or anything like that. But it was intended to get us to kind of reflect on our own biases and the stigma that we hold, and what stigma really is. And so, does anybody have any other questions or comments as we begin to kind of wrap things up? Oh, thank you, Anita. I appreciate it. I'm glad to hear that the interaction went well. I wasn't so sure how it comes off on your end. So feel free to give honest feedback if that just didn't work for you. I can continue to change things up. We're all doing things a little bit differently. So we always do it virtually anyway for a lot of these types of presentations. And the different platforms work a little bit differently. So any other questions, or any resources I can look up for you and send to you later? Oh, you're very welcome, Nicole. I'm glad you found it useful. Hopefully it was something like that. It really appreciate the explanation. Yes, thank you. It's really important to kind of think about that in that way, I think, because it does kind of challenge our perception, the idea that stigma is a mark. That's what we're doing. We're marking people and saying you are not good enough. And so I'm glad that was helpful to kind of put it in that perspective. Go ahead. Okay, well, I'm not sure. Peggy, I don't know if I want to hand things over. Oh, and Peggy is asking, and hand things back over to you, I think.
Okay, that will be fine. I just want to let everybody know that we will send out an email to you with the link to the recording for today in case you want to go back and revisit or you missed something, or for the people that may have had to pop out before the end. That you should get that this afternoon, and with it you'll get a link to the evaluation. Please fill that out, because if you're a CRC, when you fill that up and return it, it prompts our system to make the CRC form available to you, and you can print it off. That's the way you get it. Okay, I'm also going to send out the 2 links that Jennifer put in the chat box. So you will have those if you want to go back to them. I had somebody couldn't access them. Maybe it's been more than one person. And we want to thank you for participating today and for your level of participation. You have made it a good participation. And Jennifer is certainly a professional in that arena. She did a very good job today, and I appreciate it.
Well, it only works as good as the participants, so I really appreciate the effort that you all put in. And I know it was a little awkward, with chats and stuff like that, but you guys really made it work very well. So I really do appreciate the interaction that you all had today.
Thank you. And 2, on the evaluation, if you would give me what you think about doing the 3 hours together, if you like that or if you don't. I think this is the first time we've tried it. Jennifer thought it would go well, and it has. Let me know what your thoughts are for future classes. Thank you, and have a good day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Jennifer, I don't know if you can still hear me, but this was really great. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it.
This is Anita, by
Thank
the
you for
way.
the. I figured it was Anita. I thought it came up on there, so thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
I
Take
really
care.
appreciate all your participation today. You really made it a difference in there. So,
Thank you. Take care.
bye bye.